University courtyard, high society students whispering. Bianca. Lyra, I heard that gutter rat fiancé of yours actually showed up on campus today. Lyra. My father is obsessed with that old debt, but I'm not. What century is this? I'm not marrying a charity case. When he shows his face, I'm making sure he leaves in tears. Bianca. Don't worry, Lyra. My brother and I will help you welcome him. You don't want a penniless stray following you around, right? Bully. Hey you. Move. This seat is reserved for people whose shoes cost more than your life. Kian. Quietly without looking up. The seat was empty. Bully. Why the attitude, trash? You're in Sterling territory now. Wait until we're done with you. The professor enters. The introduction. Professor. Class, settle down. We have a transfer student joining us today. Introduction, please. Kian, standing up stoic. My name is Kian. Vain. Students, whispering. Vain. Never heard of it. Look at that tattered hoodie. Where did this broken loser come from? Lyra, thinking to herself. Vain. Why does that name feel like a cold blade against my neck? And those eyes. They look just like the man who saved me from the syndicate 10 years ago. No, it's impossible. That man was a king. This boy is a beggar. Bianca. Listen up. This poor guy actually thinks he's Lyra Sterling's fiancé. How pathetic. Everyone knows the Voss family runs this school. If this trash thinks he can touch Sterling, he's not just broke. He's dead. The morning sun filtered weakly through the high windows of the university's lecture hall, casting long, sharp shadows over the rows of mahogany desks. Kian Vane walked down the center aisle, his footsteps nearly silent. He wore a gray hoodie, its edges frayed and the fabric thin from years of wear, the hood pulled just low enough to shadow his eyes. To anyone else, he looked like a ghost, a gutter rat who had somehow wandered into a palace of privilege. He found a seat near the back, pulling a weathered textbook from his backpack. It was his only copy, the edges curled and the spine held together by tape, but he handled it with a precision that hinted at a much deeper discipline. The silence of the room was broken by the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels. Bianca Voss approached his desk, flanked by her usual circle of sycophants. She stopped, staring down at him with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if his very presence was an insult to the air she breathed. I thought I smelled something rotting, Bianca drawled, her voice carrying across the quiet hall. Lyra wasn't joking. You really are just a stray she found in the rain. Kian didn't look up. He opened his textbook to the first chapter, his expression as stoic as stone. I'm here for the lecture, Bianca. Not a conversation. A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the students. No one spoke to Bianca Voss that way. Her family's name was synonymous with the city's corporate elite, and her brother ran the campus social hierarchy with an iron fist. The gutter rat has a tongue, Bianca sneered. She reached out, her long, manicured nails digging into the cover of his textbook. With a slow, deliberate motion, she jerked the book toward her, the sound of tearing paper echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She ripped the first 10 pages out, letting the crumpled debris flutter to the floor like autumn leaves. Oops, she mocked, a cruel smirk spreading across her lips. I guess a beggar doesn't need to read. You should be out looking for scraps, not pretending to be a student. Kian looked down at the ruined pages. His hand tightened slightly around his pen, the only sign of the silent predator beneath the surface. He felt the weight of the lethal stakes in the room. Bianca had no idea she was mocking a man who could liquidate her family's entire fortune with a single phone call. But for now, he forced himself to endure the social aggression. He was here to protect Lyra, and the time for the status flip hadn't yet arrived. Pick it up, the student next to Bianca commanded, a boy in a leather jacket who lived to serve the Voss family. And apologize for making Bianca touch your trash. Kian finally raised his head. His eyes were cold, dark, and filled with a lethal intensity that made the boy instinctively flinch, though he didn't know why. "The book is ruined," Kian said softly. "But the knowledge is already mine. You can tear the paper, Bianca, but you can't hide the fear in your eyes when you look at me." Bianca laughed, a high, jagged sound, but her grip on her designer bag tightened. "Fear? From a boy in a tattered hoodie. You're nobody, Kian. By the end of the week, I'll have you back in the gutter where you belong." She turned on her heel, her entourage following as they stepped over the torn pages of his book. Kian sat alone in the shadow of the back row, his face a mask of calm. He reached down and gathered the crumpled paper, smoothing them out with a steady hand. The bullies thought they were winning a game of status, unaware that they were merely provoking a hidden boss who was already deciding their fate. The lecture began, but Kian wasn't looking at the chalkboard. He was looking at the back of Bianca's head, his mind already calculating the exact moment the gutter rat would become the sovereign. The shadows of the university campus felt heavier than the silence in the lecture hall as Kian stepped out into the cool evening air. The humiliation from earlier, the torn pages of his book and the sneers from the Voss clique, still hung around him like a shroud, but his stride remained rhythmic and purposeful. He bypassed the main gates where the students climbed into their European sports cars and slipped instead into a narrow, unlit alleyway behind the library, a place where the pristine marble of the institution gave way to damp brick and iron. As he moved deeper into the darkness, the sounds of the campus faded, replaced by the low, steady hum of a high-end engine idling nearby. A single obsidian black sedan sat deep in the shadows, its headlights doused. Beside it stood a man in a sharp charcoal gray suit, his posture so rigid it bordered on military. This was Marco, a high-ranking general in the Vane Syndicate, a man whose name alone could freeze the hearts of the city's underworld. As Kian approached, the gutter rat persona dissolved. He pulled back the hood of his frayed sweatshirt, revealing a face that was no longer that of a victim, but of a sovereign. Marco immediately snapped into a deep, respectful bow, his head lowering until it was level with his waist. The gesture was absolute and filled with a terrifying reverence. "My lord," Marco's voice was a low rumble, cutting through the damp air. "The operation in the Eastern District is complete." Kian stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his tattered hoodie. In this dim light, he looked like a contradiction. A boy dressed in rags being worshipped by a man who moved millions. "Report," Kian commanded, his voice devoid of the softness he used in the classroom. "The hostile acquisition of the maritime trade routes was successful," Marco stated, straightening up but keeping his eyes lowered. "We have liquidated the rival holdings and consolidated the assets under your private account. Total net gain for the quarter, $1.2 billion. Kian didn't flinch at the number. To the students at the university, a few $1,000s was a reason for a party. To him, $1 billion was just another day of rebuilding what his father had lost. "And the Voss family?" Kian asked, his tone turning cold. "I assume they were trying to bid on those same routes." "They were, my lord. They lost everything in the final hour. They are currently scrambling to cover their margins. They have no idea it was you who pulled the rug out from under them." A faint, jagged smile touched Kian's lips, the smile of a predator watching its prey walk into a trap. Bianca Voss had spent her afternoon bragging about her family's wealth, while her father was unknowingly losing a fortune to the poor students she had bullied. "Keep the pressure on," Kian said, his gaze drifting back toward the glowing lights of the campus. "I want them desperate before the final reveal." "And Lyra? Has the Voss Syndicate made their move on her family's accounts yet?" "They are moving as you predicted, sir. They believe the Sterlings are vulnerable." "Good," Kian whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone, his fingers moving with a cold efficiency. "Let them think they are winning. I want Lyra to see their true faces before I burn their world to the ground." "Understood, my lord," Marco said, bowing once more as he opened the car door. "Shall I have a suit prepared for the weekend? The board is expecting the chairman's presence." "Not yet," Kian replied, pulling the hood of his tattered gray sweatshirt back over his head, retreating into the hidden boss persona once more. The student isn't finished with his lessons. He turned and walked back toward the light of the campus, leaving the billion-dollar general and the luxury sedan in the dark. To the world, he was returning to a cold dorm room and a ruined textbook. In reality, he was a king returning to his chessboard, and the game was already over. The neon lights of the city's entertainment district flickered in the oil-slicked puddles, casting distorted reflections of blue and pink across the damp pavement. Lyra Sterling hurried down a narrow side street, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the brick. She had left the university charity gala early, hoping to avoid another conversation about her unfortunate engagement, but she had taken a wrong turn into the labyrinth of the South Ward. The air here was different, thick with the smell of exhaust and cheap tobacco. The shadows seemed to move, and before she could reach the main road, 3 men stepped out from behind a row of rusted dumpsters. They weren't students or socialites. They were the kind of low-level street enforcers the Voss syndicate used to keep the local businesses in a state of constant fear. "You look lost, princess," the leader sneered, his eyes tracing the line of her expensive silk gown. "A girl like you shouldn't be walking these streets without an escort. Why don't you let us take care of those diamonds for you?" Lyra froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached for her phone, but one of the men stepped forward, his hand snapping out to swat the device onto the pavement. "None of that. We're just having a conversation." As they closed in, Lyra backed into the cold brick of a warehouse wall, the lethal stakes of the city finally baring its teeth. She closed her eyes, praying for a miracle, when a sudden heavy silence fell over the alley. A figure emerged from the darkness behind the men. He moved with a terrifying fluid grace, his face obscured by the hood of a tattered gray sweatshirt. He didn't shout. He didn't announce his presence. He simply became part of the violence. Before the leader could turn around, the hooded figure's hand shot out, catching the man's throat in a grip of iron. With a sickening thud, the bully was slammed into the brick wall, his breath leaving him in a ragged gasp. The other 2 lunged, but the hero's shadow moved like a ghost. He pivoted, his leg sweeping the second man off his feet, while his elbow connected with the third man's jaw with the force of a falling hammer. It was over in seconds. The 3 enforcers lay groaning on the wet ground, unable to comprehend the speed of the attack. Lyra stood paralyzed, her breath hitching as the hooded figure turned toward her. For a heartbeat, she saw his eyes, dark, intense, and filled with a protective fire that felt hauntingly familiar. They were the eyes of the man who had saved her from the syndicate 10 years ago. Her lips parted, the name Kian almost escaping her breath, but the figure stepped back into the deepest shadows before she could speak. "Wait!" she cried out, her voice echoing in the narrow space. A split second later, the headlights of a luxury European sports car flooded the alley with blinding white light. The car screeched to a halt, and Julian Remington jumped out, his designer suit pristine and his expression one of rehearsed heroism. "Lyra, are you okay?" Julian shouted, rushing to her side and stepping over the fallen men. "I saw them follow you. I handled them as fast as I could." Lyra looked at Julian, then back at the empty darkness where the hooded stranger had stood just moments before. The hero's shadow was gone, leaving nothing behind but the cold damp of the rain. Did you do this, Julian?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the unconscious thugs. "Of course," Julian lied, puffing out his chest and adjusting his cufflinks. "I told you I'd always protect you. Those gutter rats didn't stand a chance against me." Lyra let Julian lead her toward the car, but she couldn't shake the feeling of those dark, familiar eyes. She looked back at the shadows one last time, unaware that Kian was standing just inches away behind a rusted iron pillar, his hand resting on the tattered scarf in his pocket, watching his heroine being driven away by a fraud. To the world, Julian was the savior. To the night, Kian was the king. The fluorescent lights of the dean's office hummed with a clinical, unforgiving buzz. Kian stood in the center of the room, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tattered gray hoodie. On the mahogany desk before him lay a diamond-encrusted watch, the very one Bianca Voss had claimed was stolen from her locker during physical education. "I found it in his bag myself, Dean Holloway," Bianca said, her voice dripping with practiced innocence. She stood by the window, her designer coat draped elegantly over her shoulders, looking every bit the victim. "I know he's on a full scholarship, but clearly, the gutter rat couldn't resist the temptation of something worth more than his entire lineage." Dean Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked at Kian with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Kian, the evidence is damning. The university has a zero-tolerance policy for theft, especially from our scholarship students. The Voss family is one of our primary donors. If they press charges, I have no choice but to sign your expulsion papers immediately." Kian didn't flinch. He didn't plead. He simply looked at the watch, then at Bianca, whose eyes gleamed with the triumph of a predator who had finally closed the trap. "You're sure about this, Bianca?" he asked softly. "Once the paperwork is signed, there's no going back for anyone in this room." "Is that a threat?" Bianca laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Dean, please. Sign the papers. Let's get this trash off our campus." Holloway reached for his fountain pen, but before the nib could touch the paper, Kian's burner phone vibrated in his pocket. He didn't take it out. Instead, he looked directly at the dean. "Before you ruin a student's life, you might want to check the morning's endowment report. I hear the university's anonymous benefactor just made a very specific change to the bylaws." Holloway frowned, his hand hesitating. "What are you talking about?" "Check your terminal," Kian commanded. The authority in his voice was so sudden, so absolute, that the dean instinctively turned toward his computer. As Holloway clicked through the secure portal, his face went from impatient to deathly pale. His eyes widened, scanning a document that had been uploaded only minutes prior. This can't be right. "What is it?" Bianca snapped, moving toward the desk. "The anonymous trust that funds 70% of this university," Holloway whispered, his voice trembling. "They've just exercised a morality clause. It states that any false accusation made by a donor's family against a student results in the immediate freezing of all building naming rights and the liquidation of the donor's legacy scholarships." Holloway looked up at Kian, his hands shaking. "The trust? It's held by Vane Holdings. And the primary signatory is you." The silence that followed was absolute. Bianca's smug expression shattered like glass. She looked from the dean to the boy in the tattered hoodie, the status flip hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "Vane Holdings," Bianca stammered, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. "That's impossible. He's a beggar. He eats noodles in the rain." "I don't just eat noodles, Bianca," Kian said, taking a step toward her. The silent predator was fully visible now, his presence suffocating the small office. "I own the grain they're made from. And I own the ground this office is built on. You wanted to use the school's rules to destroy me? You forgot that I'm the one who wrote the check for the pen you're using." He turned back to the dean, who was now standing as if a king had just entered the room. "The watch was never stolen. Check the security footage from the hallway, Dean. You'll see Bianca's lackey slipping it into my bag. If those expulsion papers aren't shredded in the next 10 seconds, the Vane endowment disappears. And with it, your career." Holloway didn't hesitate. He grabbed the papers and shoved them into the shredder, the mechanical whirring the only sound in the room. Kian looked at Bianca, whose face was a mask of pure terror. "This was your first lesson, Bianca. Don't play with fire when you're living in a house made of my paper." He turned and walked out, the hood of his tattered sweatshirt pulled back over his head. Behind him, Bianca sank into a chair, the lethal stakes of her game finally clear. She had tried to get a gutter rat expelled, unaware that she had just tried to evict the owner of the world. The sky over the city turned a bruised, metallic purple as the financial district descended into a state of absolute carnage. Inside the Sterling mansion, the silence was more deafening than the screaming sirens on the news. Lyra stood in the center of her father's expansive study, her phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. The lethal stakes of the corporate world had finally struck. In a single coordinated market raid, the Sterling Group stock had plummeted to zero. "Everything," her father gasped, his face the color of ash as he stared at the red lines bleeding across his computer monitor. "The Voss family. They promised to back our margins. Julian said his father would bridge the gap." "They aren't answering, Dad," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "Julian blocked my number. Bianca just posted a video of them celebrating their strategic acquisition of our liquidated holdings. They didn't help us. They fed us to the wolves." The realization hit like a physical blow. The bully socialites hadn't just been her friends. They had been parasites waiting for the moment the Sterlings faltered. Within an hour, the gates of the mansion were swarmed by creditors and press. The high society stability Lyra had taken for granted was revealed as a fragile glass house, and it was currently shattering. By nightfall the power had been cut. Lyra sat on the steps of the dark, cold grand staircase, her expensive silk dress feeling like a shroud. One by one, her loyal suitors and friends had vanished. Julian Remington, the man who claimed to be her protector, was nowhere to be found. Even the staff had fled, leaving the house a hollow tomb of former glory. The heavy oak front door creaked open. Lyra didn't even look up, expecting another process server or a looter. But the footsteps were steady, quiet, and hauntingly familiar. Kian Vane stepped into the foyer. He was still wearing that tattered, dirt-smudged gray hoodie, but in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows, he didn't look like a beggar. He looked like the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. He carried a small bag and a thermos, his expression the same mask of stoic calm he wore in the lecture hall. "What are you doing here, Kian?" Lyra asked, a bitter laugh escaping her throat. "To witness the gutter rat finally having better prospects than the Sterling heiress. Go ahead. Mock me. Everyone else is." Kian didn't mock her. He walked over and sat on the cold step beside her, handing her the warm thermos. "I'm not everyone else, Lyra. And being poor isn't a choice tonight, but staying is." Lyra looked at the thermos, then at the boy she had publicly disowned. "The Voss family took everything. Julian lied about saving me in the alley. It was all a game to them." She looked at Kian's tattered sleeve. "Why are you the only one who didn't run? You have the most reason to hate me." "Because I know what it's like to lose a kingdom in a day," Kian said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a billion-dollar ghost. "The people who love your crown will disappear when it falls. I'm here because I don't care about the crown. I care about the girl who once looked at a man in the rain and saw a human being, even if she forgot how to do it later." Lyra leaned her head against the cold railing, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. For the first time, the status flip wasn't about money. It was about character. The poor student was the only one with the wealth of loyalty, while the billionaires were morally bankrupt. "I have nothing left, Kian," she sobbed. "You have me," he replied, his hand resting near hers, firm and immovable. Outside, the obsidian-black sedan sat idling at the end of the driveway, hidden by the shadows of the overgrown hedges. Marco waited in the driver's seat, watching the house through thermal goggles. He keyed his radio. "The target is comforted. Shall we proceed with the counterstrike on the Voss holdings?" Kian's burner phone vibrated in his pocket. He didn't answer. He simply watched Lyra drink the warm tea. His heroine, finally safe in the shadow of the one man she thought she could never rely on. The Sterling crisis was the end of her world, but for Kian, it was the beginning of his move. He would let her see the truth of her friends, and then he would show her the power of her fiancé. The invitation arrived not as a card, but as a cruel joke pinned to the door of the university library. It was a formal summons to the Voss family's Silver and Gold Gala, an event designed to celebrate the successful merger of the sterling assets they had so ruthlessly seized. At the bottom, in Bianca's sharp, looping handwriting, were the words, "Dress code, formal. But for you, Kian, just try to wash the grease off your hoodie." Lyra stood beside him, her face pale. Since the crash, she had been staying in a modest apartment Kian had found for her, unaware that the building was a vain holding. "You shouldn't go, Kian," she whispered, clutching the invitation. "They only want to use our presence to show the world how far the sterlings have fallen. It's a public execution of our dignity." Kian took the card from her hand, his expression unreadable. "A king who loses his crown in the dark is a tragedy, Lyra. But a vulture who celebrates in the light is a target. We're going." The night of the gala, the entrance to the Grand Imperial Ballroom was a gauntlet of flashing cameras and humming engines. Julian Remington and Bianca Voss stood at the top of the marble stairs, greeting the city's elite. Julian looked like a prince in his white tuxedo, while Bianca was draped in diamonds that had once belonged to Lyra's mother. "Where is the gutter rat?" Julian chuckled to a group of investors. "I heard he was planning to arrive on a bicycle. I've even prepared a spot for him next to the dumpsters." The laughter was cut short by a sound that didn't belong in the city, a deep, low-frequency roar that vibrated through the chests of every guest on the stairs. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of an Italian sports car. It was the heavy, authoritative thrum of custom machinery. Rounding the corner was a vehicle that seemed to swallow the light around it. It was a vain sovereign, a custom-built, armored obsidian limousine, one of only 3 in existence. The body was crafted from matte carbon fiber, and its wheel rims were forged from aerospace-grade titanium. The car was a rolling fortress, a billion-dollar statement of absolute power that made the Ferraris and Lamborghinis in the valet line look like plastic toys. The crowd went silent. The press surged forward, their flashes blinding as the vehicle pulled to a silent halt at the very center of the red carpet. A driver in a charcoal-gray military-style suit stepped out and opened the rear door with a rhythmic, disciplined click. Kian Vane stepped out first. He had shed the tattered hoodie for a bespoke, hand-tailored tuxedo of midnight silk. The fit was lethal, emphasizing the broad shoulders of a man who moved empires. He didn't look like a student. He looked like the man the university was named after. He reached back into the car and offered his hand to Lyra. She emerged looking like a queen restored, wearing a gown of shimmering silver that Kian had arranged through a private courier. The status flip was so sudden and so violent that Julian dropped his champagne glass, the crystal shattering on the marble. Kian led Lyra up the stairs, his stride slow and predatory. As he reached the top, he stopped in front of a frozen Bianca Voss. He didn't say a word about her dress or the party. He simply looked at the vain sovereign idling at the curb. "The engine alone costs more than this ballroom, Bianca," Kian said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried to every ear in the foyer. "And the man who built it is the one you invited here to be mocked. I suggest you enjoy the music while you can. The bill for tonight is going to be more than the Voss family can pay." He walked past them without waiting for an answer, Lyra on his arm. The lethal stakes had shifted from the shadows to the spotlight. The poor student was gone, and the chairman had arrived to collect his due. The golden warmth of the ballroom vanished as the heavy oak doors were slammed shut and bolted from the inside. The music died in a discordant screech of violins, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots on marble. Dozens of men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by black balaclavas, flooded the balcony and surrounded the perimeter of the room. These weren't security guards. They were the Voss Syndicate's private militia, the shadow army that had built their empire on blood and fear. Bianca Voss, no longer the trembling socialite from the dean's office, stepped onto the central stage. Her face was a mask of jagged, cold ambition. Beside her, Julian Remington discarded his champagne glass, his princely demeanor replaced by a look of predatory hunger. "The gala is over," Julian announced, his voice amplified by the room's speakers. The Sterling Group didn't just fall due to market luck. They fell because we chose to end them. And tonight, the Sterling bloodline ends with their debt. The guests shrieked as the gunman forced Lyra's father and the remaining Sterling board members to their knees at the center of the dance floor. Julian drew a sleek, silver-plated pistol, pressing the cold barrel against the elder Sterling's temple. The lethal stakes were no longer about stock prices or university pride. This was a public execution. "Lyra," Bianca called out, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the silver-clad girl standing beside the man in the midnight tuxedo. "Your family owes us a debt that money can't pay. Sign over the remaining land titles and the secret codes to the Sterling vault, or watch your father become a memory." Lyra's breath hitched, her body trembling as she looked at her father's terrified face. She moved to step forward to sacrifice everything to save him, but a hand caught her arm. It was a grip of immovable iron, firm, grounding, and absolute. Kian Vane stood beside her, his expression as calm as the eye of a hurricane. He didn't look at the gunman or the silver pistol. He looked directly at Bianca, his dark eyes filled with a terrifying, ancient stillness. "You're making a mistake, Bianca," Kian said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to carry more weight than the weapons in the room. "You've spent so much time looking at the Sterlings that you've forgotten to look over your shoulder." "Shut up, gutter rat," Julian snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're a scholarship student in a rented suit. You have no power here. This is the underworld, a place where your vain holdings can't help you." "The underworld is exactly where I live, Julian," Kian replied. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted radio. He didn't look at it as he pressed the button. "Status report." A voice crackled back, cold and disciplined. "The perimeter is neutralized. All Voss Syndicate snipers have been removed. We are awaiting your command, my lord." Bianca's face went pale, her smugness shattering as a series of red laser dots appeared on Julian's chest and her own forehead. The windows of the ballroom shattered simultaneously as rappelling ropes dropped from the ceiling. Dozens of men in silent charcoal-gray tactical gear, the Vane elite guard, swarmed the balcony, their weapons trained on the Voss militia. The status flip was no longer a game of money. It was a total military takeover. "You thought you were the predators in this city," Kian said, stepping toward the stage as the Voss gunman instinctively backed away from his aura of absolute authority. "But you were just playing in a garden I built." Julian put the gun down. "You're holding a weapon against a man whose life I've decided to spare. If you pull that trigger, the Voss name will be erased from history before the body hits the floor." The air in the room turned as cold as a grave. The billionaire Mafia boss had finally dropped the mask, and the socialite villains realized they weren't facing a student, they were facing the ghost of the Vane Empire. The heavy oak doors of the Great Hall didn't just open, they shuddered under the force of a pre-planned assault. The rhythmic clanking of iron-shod boots drowned out the panicked whispers of the court, a metallic heartbeat that signaled the end of a long, calculated charade. Kian stood at the center of the chaos, his shoulders dropping the slight, weary slouch he had maintained for months. The mask of the dutiful, unassuming nephew didn't just slip, it shattered. He drew himself up to his full height, his spine straightening with a terrifying grace that made the lords nearest to him stumble backward. The flickering candlelight caught the sudden sharp clarity in his eyes. They were no longer clouded by feigned indecision, but burning with a cold, predatory light. "The theater is closed," Kian said. His voice wasn't loud, yet it sliced through the din of drawing swords and overturned benches. It was a voice designed to command battlefields, not whisper in alcoves. A phalanx of guards in obsidian dark plate flooded the perimeter, their shields locking into a seamless wall of black steel. These weren't the palace regulars. They moved with a silent, lethal synchronization that spoke of years spent in the harshest reaches of the borderlands. The royal guard, confused and outnumbered, hesitated, their eyes darting toward the throne for a command that wasn't coming. The High Chancellor stepped forward, his face a pale mask of indignation. Kian, what is this madness? You have no claim to this interference, let alone this violence. You are a cadet branch at best, a placeholder. Kian silenced him with a single sharp gesture. He reached into the high collar of his tunic and pulled free a heavy signet ring suspended on a silver chain. He didn't hand it over. He simply held it up, letting the crest catch the torchlight. It wasn't the blossoming rose of the current regime. It was the jagged, stooping hawk of a line thought extinguished during the purge of the Red Winter. The history books were written by cowards who lacked the stomach to finish the job, Kian said, his gaze fixed on the trembling king atop the dais. You called me a cadet. You called me a loyal hound. You even called me family when it suited your vanity. He stepped over a fallen goblet, the wine staining the rug like fresh blood. With every step, the air in the room seemed to grow thinner, heavy with the weight of a legacy that had been suppressed for 20 years. The guards stepped aside for him, bowing their heads in a synchronized motion that was both reverent and chilling. I am not the shadow of a dying house, he continued, his voice resonating against the stone rafters. I am the reckoning you spent 2 decades trying to bury. He stopped at the foot of the throne, looking up at the man who had worn his father's crown with unearned arrogance. A slow, lethal smile curved Kian's lips, an expression of pure, unfiltered triumph. My name is not Kian of the Marches, he declared, the words echoing like a death knell through the hall. I am Kian Vane, and I have come to collect the debt of my blood. The silence that followed was absolute. The name Vane was a ghost story, a curse whispered in the dark, a reminder of a dynasty that had ruled with iron and ended in fire. By the time the king found his voice to scream for the guards, it was already too late. The hall no longer belonged to the crown. It belonged to the ghost who had finally come home. The digital displays that had, moments ago, been scrolling through the glittering highlights of the Voss family's charitable contributions began to flicker. A low hum of static vibrated through the floorboards, a digital tectonic shift that silenced the remaining gasps in the room. Kian didn't move from his position at the foot of the dais. He simply tapped a command into the device strapped to his forearm, his movements clinical and detached. On the massive crystalline screen surrounding the ballroom, the Voss family crest, a gilded lion, was suddenly overwritten by a cascading waterfall of crimson data. Ledger after ledger began to unspool in real time. Offshore accounts, hidden shell companies, and the dark web architecture of a multi-billion-dollar empire were stripped naked before the very elite who had toasted to their success. Assets seized, a synthesized voice announced, echoing coldly through the hall. The numbers on the screen began to plummet. It wasn't a slow decline. It was a slaughter. Millions of credits vanished every second, redirected into the public accounts of the districts the Voss family had spent decades squeezing dry. The Voss Foundation was hollowed out in a heartbeat, its liquid capital redistributed with a vengeance that felt biblical. In the corner of the room, tucked away near the shadows of the marble pillars, Lyra felt the world tilt on its axis. Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn satchel. She looked from the screens, where the name Vane was now burning in gold letters, to the man standing at the center of the storm. This was the man she had shared coffee with in the rain. This was the poor student who had helped her translate ancient dialects in the back of the university library, the one who wore frayed sweaters and complained about the price of ink. She remembered the way he'd looked at her when she spoke of justice, a quiet, intense focus she had mistaken for simple admiration. It hadn't been admiration. It had been recognition. Kian, she whispered, though the word was swallowed by the chaos. He turned then, as if sensing the weight of her gaze. For a fleeting second, the terrifying king of the city vanished. The coldness in his eyes flickered, replaced by a raw, haunting vulnerability that only she was meant to see. He looked at her not as a conqueror, but as the man who had lied to her every single day to keep her out of the blast radius. The screens turned a solid, blinding white. The Voss name was gone, deleted from the city's financial registry as if it had never existed. The High Chancellor collapsed into his gilded chair, his face the color of ash, watching the literal erasure of his life's work. Kian stepped toward Lyra, the obsidian-clad guards parting like a dark sea to let him through. The crowd shrank away from him, terrified of the man who could unmake worlds with a keystroke. He stopped a few feet away from her, the heavy veined signet ring still glinting on his hand. "You told me once that the only way to fix this city was to burn the foundations," he said, his voice dropping back into that familiar quiet cadence she knew so well. "I just wanted you to see the first spark." Lyra looked at his hand, the hand of a king, and then at his face. The betrayal stung, sharp and cold, but beneath it was a terrifying realization. The student she loved was a fiction, but the man before her was the truth she had been praying for. "You're not a student," she breathed, her voice trembling. "You're the end of everything." "No," Kian replied, reaching out but not quite touching her. "I'm the beginning." The silence that followed Kian's declaration was heavier than the noise of the collapse. Lyra looked around the room, seeing the faces of the most powerful people in the city transformed by a primal, naked fear. They weren't looking at a man. They were looking at a natural disaster. Kian didn't look at them. His world had narrowed to the space between him and Lyra. The air between them hummed with the residual energy of the digital execution he had just performed, a static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "You lied," Lyra said, the words finally finding their way past the lump in her throat. She stepped back, her heel catching on the hem of her modest dress, the dress he had told her looked like starlight when he picked her up that evening. Every late night in the archives, every meal we shared. It was all a calculation. Kian's expression didn't harden. It shattered. The regal composure he had used to dismantle the Voss Empire cracked, revealing the hollowed-out boy who had survived the Red Winter. "The lies were the only thing that kept you safe, Lyra. If they had known I was a Vane, they would have used you to find me. If they had known what you meant to me, they would have burned you to ash just to see me flinch." He took another step, but the obsidian guards remained stationary, a living wall of shadow behind him. He looked down at his own hands, the fingers that had typed the commands to ruin a dynasty, and then back at her. "I am the beginning of a new city," he repeated, his voice desperate for her to understand. "But I cannot build it if the only person who knows my soul thinks I am a monster." "You are a monster to them," Lyra countered, gesturing wildly at the ruined aristocrats and the weeping chancellor. "You just erased a century of history in 5 minutes. You didn't just take their money, Kian. You took their reality. Their reality was built on your hunger." Kian's voice finally broke, a flash of the Vane fire sparking in his eyes. "The reality where you had to choose between textbooks and heat. Where the people in the lower wards die of treatable fevers while these lions toast to their own greed. That reality deserved to be erased." He held out his hand, palm up, an unspoken plea. It wasn't a command from a king. It was an invitation from the boy in the library. "The assets I seized are already being diverted to the clinics, the schools, the infrastructure they let rot," he whispered. "I didn't do this just for a crown, Lyra. I did it because you told me someone had to." Lyra looked at his hand. The gold ring of the Vane line was a heavy, archaic thing, a symbol of a bloodline that had once been synonymous with absolute power. To take his hand was to step out of the shadows and into the blinding, dangerous light of a revolution. It meant leaving the girl who studied history behind to become the woman who helped write it. Outside the hall, the city sirens began to wail, not in alarm, but in a strange, dissonant chorus that signaled the shifting of the tides. The people in the streets were seeing the same data on their screens. The blackout was over. The awakening had begun. Lyra looked at the chaos, then back at the man who had orchestrated it all for her, because of her and despite her. She didn't take his hand, not yet. Instead, she reached up and straightened his collar, her fingers brushing the cold skin of his neck. "If we're going to burn it all down," she said, her voice steadying with a newfound terrifying resolve, "you're going to need someone to make sure you don't get lost in the smoke." Kian closed his eyes for a brief second, a shuddering breath of relief escaping him. He turned to his lead commander, his voice returning to its iron-cold clarity. "Secure the palace. The Vane era begins tonight." The transition of power was not a celebration. It was a surgical operation. While the city below erupted in a confused symphony of cheers and sirens, the palace became a tomb of redirected purpose. Kian moved through the corridors with Lyra at his side, his guards clearing the way with the efficiency of a winter gale. The sycophants and courtiers who had spent years preening in these halls were ushered into the sunless lower levels, their protests silenced by the heavy thud of electronic locks. Kian didn't head for the royal bedchambers or the banquet halls. He led Lyra toward the command hub, the nerve center of the city's infrastructure. The air here was cooler, smelling of ozone and polished glass. "The first few hours are the most dangerous," Kian said, his fingers dancing across a hovering holographic interface. "The vacuum of power is a vacuum of morality. If I don't fill the space immediately, the gangs or the mid-level bureaucrats will tear the city apart for the scraps." Lyra watched the monitors. The red data of the Voss liquidation had turned into a steady, pulsing blue. She saw maps of the lower wards lighting up, grid by grid, as the redirected funds bypassed the city's corrupt filtering systems. Automated supply drones were already lifting off from the central depots, carrying medicine and food to the districts that had been starved for a generation. "You're working too fast," Lyra murmured, her eyes scanning the complex algorithms. "If you push the system this hard, the market will crash before the people even get their first meal." Kian paused, his hand hovering over a final execution command. He looked at her, his brow furrowed. "I don't have the luxury of patience. The old guard is already mobilizing their private security forces." "Then don't fight them with money," Lyra said, stepping closer to the console. She pointed to a sector of the city that remained dark. "You've given the people resources, but you haven't given them a reason to defend you. If you want to survive the night, you need to turn the city into your shield." She tapped a series of keys, overriding the broadcast protocol. "Open a channel. Not to the aristocrats, and not to the banks. Open it to the public transit hubs, the factories, and the tenements. Let them see what's actually happening in the ledgers." Kian watched her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was the same look he had given her in the library when she'd found a flaw in a century-old economic theory. He stepped back, giving her the seat. "Do it." Lyra's voice didn't shake when she spoke into the transmitter. She didn't talk about bloodlines or ancient names. She talked about the theft of the city's soul and the restitution that was currently landing in their accounts. She spoke as one of them, her words carrying the weight of someone who knew the exact cost of a kilo of grain. As she spoke, the monitors shifted. The riots in the streets didn't stop, but they changed direction. The anger that had been aimless was now focused on the strongholds of the Voss loyalists. The city was beginning to breathe in rhythm with the palace. Kian stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. The weight of the crown hadn't even touched his head yet, but the burden of the reign was already visible in the tension of his jaw. "They'll hate me for what I am," Kian whispered, looking at the screens. "They might," Lyra replied, turning to look up at him. The flickering blue light of the data reflected in her eyes, making her look as formidable as the man who had reclaimed his throne. "But they'll follow you for what you do. Just remember, Kian, the moment you start looking at them as numbers again, I'm the one who pulls the plug." Kian leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, silent moment of solidarity. The king had returned, but the student was the one holding the map.